Rethinking gender in peacebuilding. Why is gender important for peacebuilding? Gender is key to understanding power dynamics in societies, and therefore critical to building sustainable peace. International Alert has been studying gender in peacebuilding for the last 20 years, most recently in Burundi, Colombia, Nepal and Uganda. Based on this research, we are arguing for a deeper and broader understanding of gender in peacebuilding. But what does this mean? People's ability to peacefully resolve conflicts and contribute to social change partly depends on their gender identity. This is influenced by their age, social class, ethnicity, religion, sexuality, marital status, and where they live. That's why we need to think about how men and women are affected by their gender identity. For example, men can be the perpetrators of violence, but can also be vulnerable to sexual violence, and women are often the victims of violence, but can also be the perpetrators. We also need to look at people who don't fit into certain social norms, such as sexual and gender minorities, and how they're affected by issues of gender, power, and conflict. Our research focused on 4 key themes that are particularly important for gender and peacebuilding: access to justice, violence, economic opportunities, and intergenerational relations. There are no easy or quick solutions to these issues, but in the following videos we highlight some of the small but positive steps taken in the projects we've looked at that can help us start to rethink gender in peacebuilding.
Access to justice. Access to justice often depends on a person's gender identity, age, class, and where they live. In order to support inclusive peace, it is important to ensure that justice is not denied to a person based on any of these factors. Take this village, for example. It was badly affected by violent conflict, leading to migration, orphaned children, and the disappearance of relatives. Its remote location meant that information from the government on law and justice was difficult to come by, especially for women, the poor, and illiterate. Women were stigmatized if they left the village and their domestic chores. They were discouraged from leaving the house and speaking in public. Many felt unable to report cases of sexual and gender-based violence to male police officers, and even when reports were made, they were sometimes ignored. To start building a more effective justice system, it was clear that links had to be made between local, regional, and national justice structures. Peace pressure groups raised awareness of unresolved cases and successfully lobbied for them to be referred to district justice bodies. This helped to support peace locally and also created links with those advocating for justice at the district and national levels. The project avoided seeing women only as victims and worked together with men to empower them. Women learnt about their rights, and men's engagement groups challenged male perceptions of women, encouraging men to advocate for female empowerment. Men started supporting their wives more and sharing domestic tasks. This not only fostered greater understanding of the traditional burdens that women faced, but also created closer relationships between men and women within the household and improved community cohesion. Effective access to justice relies on strong connections between the local, district, and national levels. By bridging the gaps between isolated communities and the wider justice systems, this project encouraged the creation of structures that were more sustainable and better able to respond to the needs of victims.
Violence. Women, men, and sexual and gender minorities experience violence in very different ways. Understanding the complexities of these differences is important for reducing violence and building sustainable peace. In this community, for example, individuals who didn't live up to the sexual and gender norms were socially stigmatized. Sexual and gender minorities were particularly vulnerable, facing death threats, physical violence, and general discrimination. This household wasn't recognized by authorities as a real family because they didn't conform to these norms. When their village was destroyed in a disaster, they received less food rations than other families. Having lost their source of income and unable to survive on the reduced aid, they were forced into dangerous sex work, exposing them to violence. Government inaction on these issues created a sense of lawlessness around sexual minorities. This meant that more powerful male authority figures, such as members of armed groups and security forces, could do anything they wanted to sexual minorities without any consequences, thus reinforcing patterns of violence and abuse. Tackling the causes of this discrimination was crucial in reducing sexual and gender-based violence. People set up an organisation to work with local communities to raise awareness of sexual and gender minority issues and rights, and to support individuals facing discrimination or violence. They documented and publicised human rights violations at the local, national and international level, helping to raise awareness of these issues and put sexual and gender minority rights on the national agenda. Locally, they ran workshops with army, police and border and immigration staff, and provided vulnerable people with counselling and medical, financial and legal support. By supporting victims of violence in this way, and making national bodies and the general public more aware of discrimination, they created greater social acceptance of marginalised groups, and broke down patterns of sexual and gender-based violence, helping to build more peaceful communities.
Economic opportunities. Understanding the particular social expectations on men and women of providing for their families and involving men in addressing economic gender inequalities is key to building sustainable peace. It helps to make communities less violent places to live and grow up in. Take this district, for example. Communities here traditionally made a living through agriculture, but armed conflict forced them to flee to areas where they had little access to arable land. Older men found themselves unable to fulfill their traditional roles as providers for the family, and women and younger men found themselves in positions of greater economic independence. The disruption of these gender roles led to violence. Domestic abuse, for instance, became a major problem in the displacement camps, along with high levels of crime, alcoholism and suicide. Returning to their villages did not restore the old social order. Access to land was still restricted, as cases of land grabbing had become common. Women continued to suffer from domestic violence. Although most perpetrators were male, some men and boys were also affected. An organisation set up a project to support communities in overcoming poverty by creating opportunities for women's empowerment through enhancing their role in household decision-making. Both men and women were encouraged to share responsibility for bringing about change, with men who practiced gender equality asked to provide a positive example to other men. These men shared domestic chores with their wives, stayed faithful to them, denounced domestic violence, and encouraged others to do the same. Couples seminars were used to facilitate discussions between husbands and wives on their roles in the household and the wider community. This led to greater mutual respect between couples and men and women taking household decisions together, including on how to spend their money. It also strengthened women's position in society, enabling them to participate more in decision-making. By involving men in efforts to empower women, it helped them to feel validated in expressing positive behaviour, avoiding the resentment or backlash that could have arisen by using more confrontational strategies. Inequality therefore decreased, opening up more economic possibilities for socially excluded groups and reducing their vulnerabilities. This is important because when men and women become more confident and equal, their families and communities can become more dynamic and peaceful too.
Intergenerational relations. Differences between generations, including over gender roles, can lead to tensions between older and younger members of society. In order to prevent these tensions from leading to violence, it's important to be aware of these differences and find ways to create better relations. Take this village for example. When people started to return here after a violent conflict, changes in traditional gender roles they experienced during displacement caused tensions with the older generations. In the past, older men controlled most of the resources, which many felt entitled them to the deference of their wives and children, and the right to make most of the decisions. But after the conflict, women and children could no longer rely on their husbands and fathers for support. Women complained that they were earning the money, but their husbands were only spending it on themselves and not the family. To try to address these tensions, an organisation created a space where community members could talk every week for a year about the challenges they were facing. The community was organised into 4 groups according to their age and sex. The results from each group were then discussed communally. Attendance was slow at first, but a momentum built up as those attending spread the news that the discussions were important and useful. Groups were asked to define the ideal man and woman, to spell out gender roles within the household, and to talk about access to and control of resources. The project improved people's social relationships and their material well-being, and they became more inclined to listen to each other. Men listened to women, older men listened to young people, and everyone was less conscious of their status than they were before. Listening to individuals' voices in this way helped to reduce the tensions created by social stereotypes and create a new understanding among communities.